It may seem counterintuitive that in the United States, archaeology is contained within anthropology. After all, archaeologists tend to focus on material culture, that is, artifacts, things made and left behind by people, whereas anthropology is more commonly associated with living or extinct humans, actual biological flesh. So, what is the connection of archaeology to anthropology? And the answer lies in the concept that archaeology doesn't just stop with digging up artifacts and putting them in a museum and interpreting them. Instead, it extends to what were people doing with artifacts? Why were they making those artifacts? Why did they choose to leave behind certain types of material culture and not others? And what can this tell us about the way that people lived in the past and the way that we ourselves are living in the present and the way that we may live in the future? In other words, archaeology does tend to focus on things that people make, but those things that people make help us understand how people behaved and how they thought. In other words, observing material culture and its uses helps us to understand ancient behavior, which we can't directly observe. Therefore, material culture, the things that people make, is our link to past societies. Another concept that we'll be exploring within this very introductory lecture is that the past and its interpretation belongs to everyone, not just specialists. This means that archaeologists have a responsibility to provide access to archaeological findings and also information and interpretation to the general public so that everyone can share in these findings. Since the theme for this week is discovering prehistory, we have to ask ourselves, what is prehistory and why does it deserve its own method of discovery? Prehistory just describes a part of time for a particular group of people that doesn't have any sort of documentation. Nobody was writing anything down. We don't have anyone from an outside group witnessing them and writing something down. We have no documentation of what was going on in that culture that provides analysis and interpretation. Instead, we have to rely on our own investigation to interpret what people were doing, why they were doing it, and so on. Now, prehistory is a variable time period. It's not a universal stretch of time that cuts off universally across every culture. Instead, it's going to end whenever we first get written documentation or witnessed documentation, some sort of a report of that group of people. So in some places, such as some Pacific Islands, prehistory only ends 200 years ago, because that's the first time we have documentation of anything that was going on. And as writing spreads and textual documentation begins around the world, prehistory ends at that time for that particular group of people. So how do we discover prehistory if we don't have any sort of analysis or record to start off on, as we would with a historical site? Archaeologists have to rely on the evidence that people left behind to interpret what was going on. In other words, they have to rely on ancient material culture. Sometimes this can be artifacts and images purposefully created by the people themselves, but it can also be things that occurred as a consequence of their existence, such as structures they built, disturbances in the environment, such as leaving hearths where they were building fires, or smoke as the residue from those fires, or disturbing areas of land for farming. All of those can be evidence of what people were doing, such as their method of subsistence or different types of technology they were using. Also, human, animal, and plant remains can act as material culture because they are modified by people. So, of course, humans are going to bear the marks of their own lives. Things like disease, health, diet, strength, stratification of different groups of people based on what they were buried with. Also things like the age and gender structure of a population, how many old people were there, how many men were there, and so on. Animal remains can also provide material culture. What sort of animals did people domesticate? What were they eating? What were they hunting? And what sort of animal remains were they modifying for use as tools or symbolic artifacts or anything else? And finally, plant remains can also provide material culture. Domesticated plants look morphologically different than wild plants. So that can tell us if people were farming or beginning to domesticate plants. Also, plant remains can tell us what sort of things people were eating, what sort of things they were feeding their animals, what sort of things they were using for medicines or other sort of uses. So even though we don't have a written record of many of the sites that we'll be looking at, we do have a record written in the archaeological record, and that gives us a lot to start out with when we're looking at discovering prehistory. Most people have heard of anthropology, but not everyone is quite certain what it actually covers. Some people think it has to do with dinosaurs, which is actually paleontology. Other people think it has to do with insects, which is actually entomology. The root of anthropology can be found in its Greek origin, anthropos meaning humanity and logos the study of. So anthropology just means the study of humanity. Now, humanity is a pretty broad topic, so in the United States particularly, anthropology is broken into 4 subfields. In other areas of the world, these 4 subfields are not necessarily unified under a single department. And the reason they're unified in the United States has mostly to do with the way that anthropology evolved as a discipline in the United States. But in the United States, the 4 subfields are cultural anthropology, archaeology, linguistic anthropology, and physical or biological anthropology. Now, these 4 subfields may at first seem very disparate and distant from one another, but if we look at each one a little more carefully, we'll see that they are actually all closely intertwined, and cultural, linguistic, and biological anthropology all have appearances within archaeology as well. Cultural anthropology is the study of the culture of present-day societies, that is, the learned and shared behavior of groups of people. Oftentimes, and more historically, anthropology that is cultural has taken place in non-Western settings, but increasingly anthropologists are studying Western cultures and even their own cultures, and subsets of those cultures. Cultural anthropology works through ethnography. This is the collection of qualitative data about beliefs, values, and social behaviors. In other words, they understand what people believe and value and do by interviewing them, observing them, participating in their behaviors, and also sometimes handing out surveys, which is more of a sociological sort of method. Now, ethnography might seem like something that is not immediately useful to archaeology because, after all, you can't really interview people who have been dead for a very long time. But in fact, ethnography is the other end of archaeology. Archaeology begins with artifacts, the evidence of behavior, and works towards finding that behavior, whereas anthropology starts with behavior and can help us identify some of the artifacts that are associated with that behavior. So by observing how modern groups of people interact with material culture, we can begin to start to draw some parallels with how ancient peoples may have also similarly or even differently interacted with culture and with cultural artifacts. So cultural anthropology has something to offer archaeology. Linguistic anthropology is the study of the construction and use of language. It has a lot of crossover with linguistics departments, where many linguistic anthropologists are found today. It has to do with the structure of language, the evolution of language, and perhaps most anthropologically, the social and cultural context of language. That is, how social contexts influence the way people use language. That is to say, not everybody uses the same type and form of speech in all circumstances. You probably speak differently to your professor compared to the way you speak to your parents, compared to the way that you speak to your friends. Additionally, a person's cultural and social context influences the way they are expected to speak by other members of their group and other groups. So cultural expectations, ethnicity, status, and gender can all influence the way that people feel they are expected to speak or are indeed expected to speak by other members of their group. So what does linguistics have to offer for archaeology? Once again, this is a little tricky because you can't really talk to people who are long dead. But in fact, archaeology is not only prehistoric, pre-language, it is also historic. It also covers periods of time in various populations that did include written language. And we will have a whole week on writing. And so linguistic anthropology can help us in that context. Additionally, looking at how social contexts affect language can also help us understand how social contexts affected the way that people were communicating before they had a written record, communicating through symbolism, paintings, artwork, and so on. So even if linguistic anthropology isn't directly related to spoken or written language, it can certainly help us interpret symbolism, which is rampant throughout archaeology. Finally, physical or biological anthropology is the study of past and present human biological evolution and also variation. It studies how the earliest organisms with human traits, that is, hominins, evolved into our anatomically modern humans and the behaviorally modern humans we see today. The hominins arose in Africa 8 to 10 million years ago, and biological anthropologists study how they've changed physically and intellectually since that point. They also study primates, which are very similar to us due to our shared evolutionary history, and they additionally study modern human variation. Looking at how biology affects culture is one contribution that biological anthropologists can make to archaeology. Our department here at The Ohio State University contains many biological anthropologists who are interested in archaeology. These are called bioarchaeologists. And what they do is they look at physical remains, human remains, and also sometimes animal remains to study how people were stressed, what were they eating, what violence did they experience, were they sick a lot, and how all of these factors were influenced by things like gender, social status, and group subdivisions. So within our department particularly, biological anthropology is very heavily used as a tool to understand from people's physical remains how they lived in the ancient world. And that can sometimes give us information that people didn't necessarily leave behind in material remains. And material remains and physical human remains can also help interpret one another and give us a more unified picture. We'll be having a number of workbooks and some lecture material on interpreting human and animal remains as a contribution from biological anthropology. Now we come to our fourth subfield and the topic of this course, archaeology. This is the study of past human societies, usually through their material remains, which are called artifacts. It comes from archaeos, ancient, and ology, the study of, so basically the study of ancient stuff. Archaeologists are sometimes called cultural anthropologists of the past because they're essentially trying to figure out the same sort of questions that interest cultural anthropologists. Why do people behave a certain way? What cultural changes shaped and are shaping their population and their civilization? But since these people are no longer around, they have to use their material remains and sometimes their physical remains to get at those questions of behavior and cultural change. And as we've seen in our few previous slides, archaeology is related to biological, linguistic, and cultural facets of human populations. In addition to drawing tools from those three other subfields of anthropology, it can also help contribute information from the past of humanity to those other fields to understand how we've evolved, how our language has changed and been shaped, and how this results in our modern cultures. The reading for this week focused on Dr. McCorsten's visit to Lascaux Cave in Lascaux, France. This cave dates to around 17,000 years ago. This period of time in Europe is called the Upper Paleolithic. It's called some other things in other areas of the world. And Lascaux Cave is famous for having an absolutely enormous number of engravings and paintings on its walls. There are 1,500 engravings and over 600 paintings. You can see the location of Lascaux indicated on the map to the right. Lascaux Cave is an excellent example of how we can use material culture to start making some interpretations about people's behaviors and even perhaps their thoughts and beliefs. Lascaux Cave was discovered on September 12, 1940 by an 18-year-old Marcel Ravadat. he returned to the scene with his 3 friends, and they entered the cave via a long shaft. The teenagers discovered that the cave walls were covered with depictions of animals, mostly large megafauna, which I'll talk about in a moment. The cave complex was open to the public only 8 years later in 1948, but soon people took their toll. By 1955, the carbon dioxide being breathed by the cave visitors and also fungus produced by 1,200 visitors per day had begun to visibly damage the paintings. After all, one reason they'd been so well preserved was that they had been sealed off for thousands of years. The cave was closed to the public in 1963 to preserve the art. And after the cave was closed, the paintings were restored to their original state and they were monitored daily. Rooms in the cave, which you can see in the tour or in the schematic we'll look at in a second, include the Hall of Bowls, the passageway, the shaft, the nave, the apse, and the Chamber of Felines. As you might guess, the Hall of Bowls contains bowl pictures. Chamber of Felines contains feline pictures, although not as many as you might think, only about 6. Lascaux 2 was built in 1983, 200 meters from the original, is a replica of the Great Hall of Bowls in the Painted Gallery, and reproductions of other Lascaux artwork can be seen at the Center of Prehistoric Art in France. The people who painted Lascaux Cave painted some of what they knew, but not all of what they knew. Visitors to the reproduction of the cave, and perhaps even you viewing these images, may be struck by the massive animals that they depict in great and beauteous detail. The people who painted Lascaux Cave lived during the world's last glacial maximum. This was the coldest period for the last 70,000 years, that is the most recent ice age. And during colder periods of time, animals tend to get larger. This is called Bergmann's effect, and it helps them conserve heat. Therefore, we see a lot of animals that have some modern versions which are quite smaller today. And one of the interesting conundrums of Lascaux Cave is that some of the megafauna known to the painters were depicted and others were not. They depicted bison, wild horses, giant deer, aurochs, which are sort of a ancestor to the cow. You can see a picture from Lascaux Cave on the right and a reconstruction of the animal above it. Ibixes and felines, as the Chamber of Felines portion of the cave might suggest. But they didn't depict other animals which they may have indeed been hunting or encountering, like fish, wolves, raptors, and mammoths. So one of the first questions has to do with the choice of animals. Why depict some animals and not others? Another striking feature of the Lascaux cave art is that they show great knowledge of the anatomy and behaviors of animals. The animals are depicted doing various activities such as running, swimming, as we'll see later on, and also considerable skill in rendering the animal world. The animals are clearly distinguishable as what they portrayed. And we can interpret this based on fossils we have of these animals, even though most of them are no longer around in the form they took during the upper Paleolithic. Here's a schematic of Lascaux Cave. You can take a virtual tour either on YouTube or an interactive tour. The interactive tour is more fun, provided you can get it to work on your computer, because as you're going through the halls, you can actually stop when there's a pop-up and you can click on it and hover over a reconstruction of the various paintings. So that one's more fun. Try the interactive tour out first. It is in French, so it may be a little difficult to navigate, but it's pretty intuitive. And if you can't get the links to work from here, I've also posted them on the Carmen page for this week. You can see some additional renderings of various animals here, with some swimming reindeer at the top left panel. We can see some wild horses and another reindeer down there on the right. Now think back on those skillful renderings of various animals you just saw, and then take a look at this one. This is obviously a much different looking sort of animal, and there's some questions as to what it might actually depict. One is that it's a mythical creature. Some people have said it's an attempt to depict a unicorn, maybe a bit fancifully. Maybe it's just a bad artist or a very new artist trying to imitate the masters. Or there's another interpretation. Some people have interpreted this as an ancient shaman dressed in an animal hide because it kind of looks like a person hunched over within an animal hide leading a procession. There's an excerpt about this in your reading from today, and I'll read a portion of it. Dr. McCorston says, I remember it as the last one, as Jacques Marcel drew our attention to the unwieldy antennae-like horns and sagging pelt of a creature like no other, awkward and unconvincing in its crude shape. Instructing us to do the same, he lifted a flat hand before his eyes to block out of the view just the upper muzzle of the first animal. It was, he suggested, a human in disguise, wearing pelt and fashioned horns, somehow meaningful as the only human in its position at the beginning of the procession. Whether this is a hunter, a shaman, a mythical being, or some unknowable role, I found myself gazing on the bearded face of a Paleolithic man 200 centuries beyond his time. Based on your chapter reading, we know that people were not actively living in Lascaux Cave. It was not their home, and yet they still left behind artifacts that they used to construct the paintings. For example, here are two artifacts mentioned in your reading. The limestone lamp from Lascaux Cave used animal fat within a limestone shell and plant wicks to provide light, sort of like an oil lamp. There's also a plant fiber rope, which has been calcified in its impression in soft clay on the floor of Lascaux Cave. Dr. McCorriston also mentions that she was offered and took a rock from the floor of Lascaux Cave. Here's a picture of it. Just as a reminder, this rock was not from the original creation of the cave, so this is not something that would have been touched by prehistoric hands. Instead, it was from the creation of the doorway which led into the cave in the mid-20th century. So considering that on the one hand it's part of an archaeological site, but on the other hand it's not an artifact itself from that archaeological time period, I'm going to ask you next week in your discussion about the ethics of taking this rock from the site. So keep this in mind and come back to it when you're doing your discussion for week 2. How do we begin to interpret the culture, the beliefs, and the intentions of the people who painted Lascaux Cave and left behind some of these curious artifacts? First of all, we can start to understand the time period in which these individuals lived. Lascaux Cave falls within a geological epoch, which is a very long period of time, called the Pleistocene. This ranges from 2,588,000 years ago to 11,700 years ago. To give you an idea of when this time period spans, the Pleistocene contains essentially all of the species within the genus Homo. So Homo habilis evolves around 2.5 million years ago, right at the start of the Pleistocene. Then you have Homo erectus, you have Homo heidelbergensis, you have Homo neanderthalensis, and then you have a wave of anatomically modern humans that evolve in Africa around 200,000 years ago. And they start migrating out to Europe and Asia, and they start interbreeding with and replacing the Neanderthals and other archaic humans that are living there. So even though the Pleistocene is a very long epoch, it can be narrowed down into slightly smaller sections of time. The Upper Paleolithic is a subdivision of the Paleolithic, or the Old Stone Age, as it is understood in Europe, Africa, and Asia. It's also called the Late Stone Age. So it's kind of a confusing multiplicity of terms here, both this Late Stone Age or the Old Stone Age and the Upper Paleolithic. All of those refer to the same time period. The Upper Paleolithic is still a pretty broad, expansive years. It dates between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago. So that's sort of the appearance of behavioral modernity. That is a lot of really new, complex tools, symbolic representations, things like exploiting new fishing resources, using nets to catch sea animals, and so on. All of these appear quite rapidly and broadly at around 50,000 years ago. So that's the start of the Upper Paleolithic, sort of this explosion of behavioral modernity that occurs in Europe and other places around the world. And it lasts until about 10,000 years ago, which is when people start to domesticate plants and animals. And it's the advent of farming, which leads to a lot of cultural changes, such as increased sedentism, staying in one place, and also the rise of cities and subdivision of labor and so on. So the Upper Paleolithic is sort of the time period when people are modern in their behavior. They're becoming more modern culturally, behaviorally modern, but they are not yet farming, and so they're still basically hunters and gatherers. And that's what the Upper Paleolithic encompasses. And this is the time period into which Lascaux Cave would fall. This display really gives you a better idea of what a tiny portion of the Pleistocene is the Upper Paleolithic. And if you want to get even more specific, Lascaux Cave is a Magdalenian portion of the Upper Paleolithic. So what was going on during the Upper Paleolithic, during this time period between so-called behavioral modernity and the advent of farming? Well, this period has the earliest remains of organized settlements in the form of campsites. Some have storage pits. Now, humans had developed fire a lot many years before this, around the time of Homo erectus, but this was the first time that they really start to show extensive signs of staying in one place, being sedentary. We also see technological advances, and this is one marker of the so-called behavioral modernity, including things like significant developments in flint tool manufacturing, very finely manufactured blades, which are quite difficult to make. We'll learn about that in this course. Also advanced darts and harpoons, and the fish hook, the oil lamp and rope, and the invention of a needle that had an eye in it. That is, a needle that could pull thread through clothing. A sort of sewing needle had existed prior to this. It was invented by Neanderthals, and it was an awl, so it was just basically a rock with a pointy bit on it, and it could poke holes in clothes, and then you could manually thread the sinew or whatever you were using as your string through it. But it did not make very tightly fitting clothing. So people still were pretty cold with those loosely fitting clothes on. And the invention of the sewing needle has been one thing that helped people have tightly fitting clothing that allowed them to expand into colder climates and fare better in those climates. So my undergraduate advisor used to say, the single most invention in the history of the world, the single most important invention, is the invention of the sewing needle. In addition to technological advances, another marker of behavioral modernity that appears during this time period is artistic work and symbolic representations. This is oftentimes seen as a marker that people were thinking on a more abstract level. So we see things like Venus figurines, the very voluptuous females carved in soft stone. We'll look at those later. Cave painting, carvings and engravings on bone or ivory, and exotic raw materials that were being found far from their sources, which suggests that people were starting to trade over long distances between groups. And part of this trade was the emergence of more complex social groupings, and this was supported by more varied and more reliable food sources being brought in by these varied tool types. One thing that may be a bit surprising with this explosion of behavioral modernity and technology, art, settlement, and so on, is that people actually were probably pretty miserable during the Pleistocene. The Pleistocene was colder and more variable, meaning it was more unpredictable. And these changes in climate have been postulated to be responsible for changes in human behavior. People had to invent new technologies and develop new behaviors to help them adapt to this colder climate and to exploiting resources in a colder and sparser climate, and also to dealing with more sudden and unpredictable changes in the climate and in their environment. And so these changes in human behavior, such as new technologies for exploiting new resources, have been associated partially by some theorists with these changes in climate during the Upper Paleolithic. So now we know that the people of Lascaux Cave were doing some very interesting things with symbolism. And we also know that during this time period, there were climatic changes that helped contribute to an explosion of new technologies, new capacities for symbolic thought, new trades between groups, and new patterns in settlement. So we know a little bit more about the context that helped create the capacity for this symbolism in Lascaux Cave. But we still don't really know what the symbols mean. So now we can bring in the science. What we can do in archaeology is a systematic study of relationships between remains. We can look at the chronological order of remains, such as tools getting more complicated over time, or styles for pottery fading in and fading out. We can also look at the spatial distribution of remains and of artifacts. How widespread was a certain style of artifact? How many groups did it spread between? Was it just one person's household, or was it over a whole region of territory? And exactly how did it travel between these spaces? So we can start to look for patterns in material culture. We can look for patterns in time. We can look for patterns in space. We can also look for associations between different types of material culture and their location and environment. And then we can start to use inductive reasoning to think about and hypothesize what behaviors might have caused those patterns. We can then test this hypothesis. We'll be talking in our next week's lecture about various ways to test hypotheses. We can experiment, such as figuring out ways to make a stone tool. We can replicate things like reconstructing a pot that has been broken apart, or finding out that shattered pieces of ivory were actually once a flute, as we'll see later. And we can also do things like modeling movements of people, as we'll learn in human ecology, to find the most efficient exploitation of resources and predict where a group of people might have moved. Essentially, all of this adds up to observing material culture and hypothesizing how it might be used, and then testing whether those uses actually work can help us understand the behaviors, which we can't directly observe. Even though we all learn inductive reasoning through the scientific method and other forms, deductive reasoning is a really easy trap to fall into, especially when you're looking at archaeology. This is the way that deductive reasoning might work. You look at something like Lascaux Cave, and you start to come up with all of these different ideas about what could possibly be going on, what could possibly be the symbolism. So you have your theory, you make a hypothesis, and then you try to find observations that fit your hypothesis. If you find ones that confirm your hypothesis, you wrap it up, call it a day, and publish a paper which will probably be rejected through peer review. And why would it get rejected? Because you started out already thinking you knew what the answer was, and then you just tried to find stuff that supported your idea. And that's unfortunately, even though it's fun, not the way that archaeology actually effectively finds out what's going on. Because our theories, the things we jump to immediately, are shaped by our own experiences, our own beliefs, our own behaviors. So if we rely on thinking, I would do it this way, so ancient people also must have done it that way, then we're going to not see differences between our way of thinking and the way of thinking of the populations and the past societies that we're examining. So to help us find the actual patterns, we need to start out without making assumptions. We make observations about things like chronological distributions, spatial distributions, and associations between artifacts and their environment and their context. We start to find patterns, and then we can support a tentative hypothesis and test it, and then we can get our theory and continue to feed back into more observations to help us embolden or perhaps reject that theory if it turns out to not be correct. So by starting out by looking for a pattern and not supporting a theory, we open ourselves up to a lot of really interesting conclusions, which could be the actual reasons that people were doing things, even though those may not have immediately occurred to us based on our own knowledge, experience, and bias. Other sites that are a little earlier than or contemporary with Lascaux Cave and in the same region can lend some more understanding to the way of life of the painters of this mysterious cave. We can look, for example, at Hohlefels, which is a cave near Ulm, Germany. The next picture will show you the entrance to this site. Even though Hohlefels does not contain painted caves, we see a lot of other evidence of creativity signifying behavioral modernity very close to its origin at 50,000 years ago. We see a lion man figure dating to 40,000 years BP. This is an ivory sculpture that is the oldest known zoomorphic or animal-shaped sculpture in the world. And the sculpture has been interpreted as anthropomorphic, meaning it gives human characteristics to an animal. So some people have said it may have represented a deity, for example. And the anthropomorphic characteristics would just be that it's standing up on two legs like a person and not very much like a lion. This sculpture was carved out of mammoth ivory from obviously a mammoth, an extinct mammoth, using a flint stone knife, and you can see the excellent craftsmanship. And the sculpture was actually found broken into pieces and had to be painstakingly reassembled. So we see quite a bit earlier than Lascaux Cave, which remember dates to around 17,000 years BP. We see very artistic craftsmanship. We see zoomorphic representations, animal representations, and we also see that there are some human characteristics being symbolically assigned to this figure. We also see evidence of music. A flute dating to 35 years BP was also found at Houlefels. And this 5-holed flute has a V-shaped mouthpiece. It's actually made from the wing bone of a vulture. And the discovery is the oldest confirmed find of any musical instrument in history. And if you click on the link, you'll get to hear a little bit about its discovery, partially in German, partially in English. And you'll also, if you listen to the end, get to hear the flute being played. We can also look at the site of Pincevant, a large Upper Paleolithic, late Magdalenian, open-air site east of Paris. It's found at the confluence of the Seine and the Yonne. And you can see some reconstructions of that site on the next image. Like Houlefels, Pincevant is mentioned in your reading briefly, and it's really interesting because it's an open-air site, so it's not in a cave. People were camping out in the open. But it shows that there is a communal living going on. There are multiple hearths, that is fireplaces, at the site that are clearly contemporary because the same carcass was shared between these sites. So there's evidence of contemporary sites and also that people were sharing between campsites. We see artifacts and debris of flint, including conjoined flint, dating to 12,000 to 11,000 years ago in at least 15 different occupations. There are over 100 tent or hut habitations. You can see a reconstruction of what this may have looked like to the right, and 20 large hearths or fireplaces. So we can see that in addition to living and sometimes just painting inside caves, groups of people during the Upper Paleolithic were also living out in the open, but they were additionally showing some sites of settlement, such as sharing between groups and also having repeated occupations of a site. Another artifact mentioned in your reading briefly is this Magdalenian carving of swimming reindeer from the rock shelter of Montestruc. This is in France, and it dates to the late Magdalenian period, around 13,000 years ago. So some interesting facts can be drawn from this, in addition to the excellent craftsmanship. First of all, it is carved from the tip of a mammoth tusk. You can kind of still see the shape of it. And it shows 2 reindeer, one behind the other. The reindeer in front is a female, which you can tell because it has a smaller body and smaller antlers. And her body is carefully shaped and shaded with incised lines made by a stone engraving tool called a burin. Delicate lines are also shown of the variation in color and texture on her coat. But there's a lot more graphic display on the back here, 10 deep incisions on both sides of her body. Now this could represent 2 basic things. One could be bars of color, but because they're so deep and because the trails on tiny lines underneath each one appear unnatural, these could actually just be a tally mark of how many reindeer the owner of this artifact had killed. An interesting fact about this additionally is that the reindeer are swimming. The antlers are laid along the back, so their neck is kind of forward, and the legs are extended with their noses up and antlers back. And that harkens back to that depiction of swimming reindeer that we saw in Lascaux Cave. Another interesting fact that we can draw from this artifact is that people were portraying animals that were not necessarily contemporary with their occupation. They tend to cross rivers in the autumn on migration, to their mating grounds and winter pastures. And we know it's the autumn because they have antlers on both animals, and some of the characteristics of the female coat are also characteristic of autumn. But the animal remains found at Montestruc show that people were camping there in the summer, not in the autumn. So it may have been either a memory of a previous occupation or some other sign indicating it's not necessarily just something people are making when they see an animal right there. It's actually potentially referential to an event or a concept at a different time or a different place. People were also painting caves in South America, in Argentina, Santa Cruz. We see here the Cueva de las Manos, which is Cave of the Hands in Spanish. And this cave art dates between 13,000 and 9,000 years ago. So that was fairly close to when the indigenous populations migrated to the New World via the Bering Strait. Several waves of people occupied this cave, and the age of the paintings themselves was calculated from the tools that were used to make them. Essentially, people would place their hands on the cave and use a bone pipe to spray paint around their cave, creating a silhouette. And these bone pipes were used to date the age of the paintings. And it's not just hands that we find in the Cave of the Hands. We also find rheas, felines, geometric shapes, zigzags, representations of the sun, and also hunting scenes. So this gives you kind of a good idea of how it's not just the Upper Paleolithic in Europe that was producing these interesting symbolic representations. It's also something that was occurring around the world, as we'll see on the next slide. Your reading concludes by talking about the diversity of outcomes. This is basically the idea that culture does not work the same way in every group of people. A pervasive idea in very early thinking was that each culture evolved along a very set path and everyone passed through the same stages and had the same technology and the same artwork and so on. But we now know that groups of people are, number one, culturally responding to their history, their environment, their current circumstances, and the trajectory of the individuals in the group. And number two, that the same sort of responses to the environment can manifest in very different ways. So we see, for example, symbolic thinking emerging in this sort of behavioral modernity explosion, but it manifests differently in different places around the world. We already saw the painted hand stencils in Argentina. We also find petroglyphs carved into rock in Arizona and California. We see Venus figurines in Europe, those voluptuous women, which may represent anything from fertility to a hope for better nutrition to a depiction of the artist herself looking down at her body. There are a whole bunch of theories for Venus figurines. Some of them are actually intentionally thrown into the fire to shatter while they're still wet, if they're made of clay. And we also see in Israel cord-strung shell beads. We see bodies all over the world being buried with pigments such as ochre. And we also see a lot of these different resources being moved over long distances in the form of trade, even quite early in this behavioral modernity explosion. So even though people are starting to embrace symbolic thinking around roughly the same time in a lot of different places, it emerges in a lot of different ways. So history is not the same for everyone. We have a diversity of outcomes, and it's based on many factors which cannot be universally predicted for all peoples. Ethical treatment of people, archaeological sites, archaeological artifacts, and so on is a concept that we'll return to again and again throughout the course. We'll get a start to it in week 2 when we discuss whether or not Dr. McCorriston should have taken the rock she was offered from Lascaux Cave and whether or not she should return it. But it's going to be a principle that runs throughout pretty much every treatment of the archaeological site, the artifacts contained there, and the people who have an interest and an investment in it. There are a number of archaeological principles that have been laid out by the Society for American Archaeology, and I've reproduced them here from Fagan's introductory text, Ancient Lives, in 2000, because the actual document is quite long. I've linked it at the bottom of the next slide, though. And basically, there are 7 principles. First of all, archaeologists must practice and promote the stewardship of the archaeological record for the benefit of all people. Stewardship means taking care of something. That includes things such as having good excavation practices, leaving the site in a way that it can still be used by other people, making sure that artifacts are cared for and that they go to the people who should see them. We'll talk all about that with a number of different restrictions on archaeological artifacts being moved around. Also, they need to consult effectively with all groups affected by their work. This would include things like the descendants of any people they might be excavating, the people who live around or are otherwise associated with the land on which they are excavating, and the group of people who are descended from or have an interest in the culture that they are investigating. They also need to avoid activities that enhance the commercial value of archaeological objects. So they need to essentially not make it attractive for people to illegally, or even get around it and do it legally, trade archaeological objects for commercial benefit. And this is to promote archaeological objects being cared for appropriately rather than taken by treasure hunters out of context where they can no longer be interpreted, or amassed by private collectors where nobody can look at them or study them. Archaeologists also have a responsibility to educate the public in the importance of their findings and to enhance public understanding of the past. This is partially self-serving because, of course, archaeologists want to continue to show that their life's work has value, but it's also important for helping people understand that they can learn from the past and not repeat it, and that lessons learned in the past can help us succeed in the present and in the future, and help understand where we came from and a number of other important concepts. If archaeologists are applying for a National Science Foundation funding grant, they actually have to explicitly include a section where they talk about broader impacts, where they discuss how they'll be reaching people beyond their immediate discipline and their immediate colleagues. Archaeologists also have a responsibility to publish their findings in a widely accessible form. This is typically a journal, but increasingly archaeologists are also doing things like having ongoing blogs or websites where people can keep up with their work. And this goes back towards educating the public and keeping up public interest as well. Archaeologists also need to preserve their collections, records, and reports, both to help educate future generations and to allow other archaeologists to look into and confirm and expand upon that work. And finally, they need to never undertake research without adequate training, experience, and facilities to complete the task at hand. And that just goes back to proper documentation, preservation, publication, essentially not doing things that will make the information unusable and damaged for other people who come along later.